When my dad remarried, I didn't think much of it at first. He'd been single for years after the divorce, and I figured it was about time he found someone new. What I didn't expect was for him to fall for someone with a daughter who was the same age as me. Her name was Emily, and she moved into our house with her mom just a week after the wedding. I remember standing in the living room, watching as they hauled in boxes and suitcases, my dad beaming like a kid on Christmas morning. "This is your new sister," he said, his voice dripping with pride. Sister. The word felt strange, wrong even. Emily and I barely knew each other. Yet here we were, being thrust into the same space, expected to play happy family. She smiled at me, her lips curving into something polite but distant. Her dark hair framed her face perfectly, and her eyes held a sharpness that told me she wasn't any happier about this arrangement than I was. The first few weeks were tense. Emily and I tiptoed around each other, exchanging awkward greetings in the hallways and barely speaking during meals. She spent most of her time in her room, headphones on, while I buried myself in video games to avoid the uncomfortable reality of our new living situation. But avoidance only worked for so long. Sharing a house meant inevitable encounters, and slowly, those brief interactions started to stretch into something more. It was late one night when it first happened. I was in the kitchen, rummaging through the fridge for a snack, when Emily walked in wearing an oversized hoodie and shorts. Her hair was messy, and she looked like she hadn't planned on running into anyone. "You're up late," she said, her voice casual as she grabbed a glass of water. "So are you," I replied, not looking at her. We stood there in silence for a moment, the hum of the fridge filling the void. Then she laughed, soft and unexpected. "This is weird, isn't it?" she said, turning to face me. "What is us?" she said, gesturing between us. "Living together, pretending like we're siblings or something." I shrugged, trying to act indifferent, but her words struck a chord. As the weeks turned into months, the lines between us began to blur. Emily and I found ourselves spending more time together, whether it was watching TV in the living room or sitting on the porch late at night, talking about anything and everything. She told me about her old life, the friends she missed, the school she hated, and the father she barely remembered. I listened, offering my own stories in return. It felt strange, opening up to someone who was technically family but still felt like a stranger. But the strangest part was how easy it became. She started borrowing my things, my hoodies, my headphones, and leaving little pieces of herself scattered around my room. At first, it annoyed me, but then I realized I didn't mind. In fact, I liked it. It was subtle at first, the way things changed between us. A lingering glance here, a playful shove there. We laughed more, teased each other more, and somewhere along the way, the walls we'd built around ourselves began to crumble. I remember the first time I really noticed it. We were sitting on the couch, watching some mindless movie late at night while our parents were out. She was curled up at the other end, her legs tucked beneath her, and I couldn't help but glance at her. The way the light from the TV danced across her face, the softness in her expression, it made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. She caught me looking and smirked. "What?" "Nothing," I said quickly, turning back to the screen. But from that moment on, I couldn't stop noticing. One night, when the house was quiet and the world outside felt miles away, Emily knocked on my bedroom door. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Yeah," I said, sitting up in bed. She stepped inside, her arms crossed over her chest. "I couldn't sleep," she said, leaning against the doorframe. I nodded, not trusting myself to say much. She hesitated for a moment before sitting down on the edge of my bed. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong here?" "Every day," I admitted. She smiled faintly, her eyes meeting mine. "Me too." For a moment, we just sat there, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between us. And in that moment, I realized something that terrified me. I didn't see her as my sister. After that night, everything changed. Emily and I didn't talk about what had passed between us, but it lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. Every glance, every shared moment seemed to carry more weight. We didn't mean for it to happen. At least I didn't. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to ignore the pull between us. It was like gravity, relentless and undeniable. It was late one evening when things finally began to unravel. Our parents had gone out for dinner, leaving the house to us. Emily and I were sitting on the porch, the cool night air wrapping around us as we passed a mug of hot chocolate back and forth. "You ever think about how weird this all is?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet. "What do you mean?" "This," she said, gesturing to the space around us. "Us. Being forced into this family." I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Yeah, it's complicated." She laughed softly, a sound that felt almost bitter. "That's one way to put it." We sat in silence for a moment, the night sounds filling the void. And then she said something that stopped my heart. "Sometimes I forget we're supposed to be siblings." Her words hung in the air, heavy and charged. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. But I could feel her watching me, waiting for a reaction I wasn't sure I could give. A few days later, it happened. It was something small, insignificant even, but it felt like crossing a line I could never step back over. Emily had borrowed one of my hoodies, as she often did, and came into my room to return it. She tossed it onto my bed and sat down beside me, close enough that our knees brushed. "You need to stop letting me steal your clothes," she said with a grin. "Maybe I like seeing you in them," I said before I could stop myself. Her smile faltered, just for a moment, and I realized what I'd said. My heart pounded as she looked at me, her expression unreadable. "You're not supposed to say things like that," she said softly. "I know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But neither of us moved. After that, it was like we couldn't help ourselves. It started with small things, sitting closer on the couch, holding each other's gaze a little too long. But the tension between us grew, crackling like static electricity, until it became impossible to ignore. One night, as we were watching TV, Emily shifted closer to me, her shoulder brushing against mine. My breath caught, but I didn't move away. "You're so quiet," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "So are you," I replied, my throat tight. She turned to look at me, her eyes searching mine. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, the only sound the faint hum of the TV. And then she leaned in, just slightly, as if testing the waters. My heart raced as I leaned back, just enough to break the moment. "Emily, we can't." She pulled away quickly, her cheeks flushing. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what I was thinking." "It's okay," I said, though it was anything but. But that moment left a crack in the fragile barrier we'd built between us, and there was no repairing it. As the days went on, our parents began to notice something was off. It wasn't that we were doing anything overtly wrong, but the shift in our dynamic was hard to miss. "You two have been spending a lot of time together," my dad remarked one evening, his tone casual but probing. "We're just getting to know each other," Emily said quickly, her smile too bright to be genuine. Her mom nodded, but her eyes lingered on us for a moment longer than I was comfortable with. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking a dangerous line, one that could shatter everything if we weren't careful. The tension came to a head one evening when our parents were out. Emily and I were in the living room, the silence between us thick with everything we weren't saying. She sat down beside me, closer than she usually did, and looked at me with an intensity that made my pulse race. "Do you ever wish things were different?" she asked, her voice soft. "Every day," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. She smiled faintly, her eyes searching mine. "Me too." And then, before I could think better of it, I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she laced her fingers with mine, her grip steady but trembling. "We shouldn't," I said, my voice barely audible. "I know," she whispered, but neither of us let go. The moment we held hands, I knew there was no turning back. It felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff, knowing the fall would destroy us both, but unable to stop myself. Emily's hand in mine was warm, trembling slightly, but she didn't pull away. I wanted to say something, anything that would make this moment less real. But no words came. Instead, we sat there in silence, the air between us thick with everything we couldn't say aloud. Eventually, she let go, standing abruptly and muttering something about needing to go to bed. I didn't try to stop her. I just sat there, staring at the empty space where she'd been, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. The next morning, Emily avoided me entirely. She stayed in her room for most of the day, emerging only when she absolutely had to. I couldn't blame her. I was just as much at a loss for how to face her as she was to face me. Our parents didn't seem to notice the shift at first. They were too wrapped up in their own lives to pay close attention to the dynamics between us. But it wasn't long before small cracks began to show. At dinner that evening, Emily was uncharacteristically quiet, her usual quick wit replaced by monosyllabic answers. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" her mom asked, glancing at her with concern. "Yeah, just tired," Emily replied, avoiding eye contact. I kept my head down, focusing on my plate and hoping no one would direct the conversation my way. 2 days later, the tension finally boiled over. It was late at night, and the house was quiet. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a soft knock at my door. My heart raced as I sat up, knowing who it was before I even answered. Emily stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself like a shield. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She sat on the edge of my bed, her head bowed as she twisted her hands nervously. "I can't stop thinking about the other night," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Neither can I admitted, sitting down beside her. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and longing. "This is wrong," she whispered. "I know," I said, my chest tightening. But even as we said the words, neither of us moved. It happened before I could stop it. One moment, we were sitting there, staring at each other in the dim light of my room. The next, she was leaning in, her breath warm against my skin. I froze, my mind screaming at me to pull away, to stop this before it went any further. But I didn't. Instead, I closed the distance between us, my lips brushing hers in a kiss that felt both terrifying and inevitable. For a brief moment, the world fell away. There were no parents, no rules, no consequences, just her and me, tangled in something we couldn't control. When we finally pulled apart, her eyes searched mine, her expression a mix of guilt and longing. "We can't let this happen again," she said softly, though her tone lacked conviction. "I know," I replied, though deep down I wasn't sure I believed it. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and awkward silences. Emily and I avoided each other as much as possible, but when we did cross paths, the tension was palpable. Our parents started to notice. "You two have been acting strange lately," my dad remarked one evening, his tone light but probing. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah, everything's fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. Emily nodded in agreement, but the way her mom looked at her made my stomach twist. After dinner, Emily pulled me aside, her expression panicked. "They're starting to suspect something," she said, her voice low. "Just act normal," I said, though my heart was pounding. "They don't know anything." But the fear in her eyes told me she wasn't convinced. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, fear, longing, all tangled together in a knot I couldn't untie. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my room. A moment later, Emily slipped inside, closing the door softly behind her. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice barely audible. I sat up, my chest tightening as she crossed the room and sat beside me. "We need to stop this," she said, though her hand reached for mine as she spoke. "I know," I replied, my voice hollow. But as her fingers laced with mine, I realized stopping was the last thing either of us wanted. The next day, everything fell apart. Our parents announced over breakfast that they were planning a weekend trip, leaving Emily and me alone to bond while they were away. The idea of being alone with her for an entire weekend both thrilled and terrified me. I could see the same conflict in her eyes as she forced a smile and nodded along with the plan. When they left that Friday evening, the house felt impossibly quiet. Emily and I avoided each other for most of the night, each of us retreating to our respective rooms. But by the time the clock struck midnight, I found myself standing outside her door, my hand poised to knock. When she opened the door, her expression said everything I was feeling. When our parents left, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. Their absence hung in the air, a silent permission we didn't dare acknowledge but couldn't ignore. I spent most of the evening in my room, trying to distract myself with music and games, but nothing worked. Every sound, every creak of the house reminded me that Emily was just down the hall. It was after midnight when I found myself standing outside her door. My hand hovered over the wood, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was doing, but before I could talk myself out of it, I knocked softly. The door opened almost immediately. Emily stood there in an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. She didn't look surprised to see me. "I couldn't sleep," I said, my voice barely audible. "Me neither," she replied, stepping aside to let me in. Her room was dimly lit by the soft glow of a bedside lamp. I sat on the edge of her bed, unsure of what to say. She closed the door quietly and joined me, sitting so close that our knees brushed. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on us. Then she reached out, her fingers brushing against mine. "This is wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," I said, though neither of us moved. Her hand lingered, and when she finally looked up at me, the vulnerability in her eyes shattered what little resolve I had left. I leaned in before I could stop myself, and she met me halfway. The kiss was soft, tentative, but it felt like a dam breaking. Every emotion we'd been suppressing, fear, guilt, longing, rushed to the surface, overwhelming us both. When we finally pulled apart, her eyes searched mine, her breathing unsteady. "What are we doing?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted, my chest tightening. "But I can't stop." She didn't say anything, but the way she leaned into me, resting her head against my shoulder, told me she felt the same. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, wrapped in a fragile silence that neither of us dared to break. The next morning, the guilt hit me like a freight train. I avoided Emily as much as I could, spending most of the day in the garage, pretending to work on a project I didn't care about. But avoiding her only made things worse. When our parents called to check in that evening, I could barely focus on the conversation. Every word felt like a lie, every laugh a betrayal. "Is everything okay?" my dad asked, his tone light but probing. "Yeah," I said quickly. "Everything's fine." Emily, who was sitting across the room, avoided my gaze, but I could feel her tension radiating like heat. That night, Emily came to my room. I was lying on my bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard the soft knock at the door. "Come in," I said, my voice strained. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm. I sat up, my chest tightening. "I know." She hesitated, her arms wrapped around herself. "This can't happen again," she said finally. "We'll ruin everything if it does." "I know," I repeated, though the thought of stopping felt impossible. She sat down beside me, her gaze searching mine. "I don't want to hurt anyone," she whispered. "Neither do I," I said, my voice barely audible. But even as we said the words, the space between us seemed to disappear. I reached for her hand without thinking, and she didn't pull away. The next day, our parents came home. I thought the weekend would have given me time to prepare, but their arrival hit me like a tidal wave. My dad seemed oblivious, laughing and chatting about their trip, but Emily's mom watched us closely. Her gaze lingered on Emily, on me, on the way we avoided looking at each other. That evening, as we sat around the dinner table, the tension was almost unbearable. Emily barely touched her food, and I could feel my dad's eyes flicking between us, his brow furrowing. "You two have been quiet," he remarked, his tone light but pointed. "Just tired," I said quickly, forcing a smile. Emily nodded in agreement, but her mom didn't look convinced. After dinner, Emily's mom pulled her aside. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the way Emily's shoulders tensed told me it wasn't good. When she finally came back to the living room, her face was pale, and her eyes wouldn't meet mine. "What did she say?" I whispered when no one else was around. "She thinks something's going on," Emily replied, her voice shaking. My chest tightened. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing," she said quickly. "But we need to be more careful." "Careful." The word felt like a cruel joke. We'd already gone too far, and no amount of caution could erase what had happened. After that night, everything felt different. The house, once filled with the mundane rhythms of daily life, now seemed like a minefield, every step fraught with the potential for disaster. Emily and I barely spoke, each of us retreating into our own corners of the house, avoiding eye contact and casual conversation. But avoidance didn't make the guilt go away. If anything, it made it worse. Every silence felt like an accusation, every glance from our parents like a question they were too afraid to ask. Emily's mom was the first to break the uneasy peace. One evening, as we were all watching TV, she turned to Emily and said, "You've been awfully quiet lately. Is everything okay?" Emily froze, her eyes darting to me for the briefest of moments before she forced a smile. "I'm fine," she said, her voice too bright. "Just tired." Her mom didn't look convinced. From that moment on, things changed. Emily's mom began watching us more closely, her eyes lingering a little too long whenever we were in the same room. My dad, oblivious as always, chalked it up to her being protective, but I knew better. She was suspicious, and every day her suspicion grew. One afternoon, while our parents were out running errands, Emily cornered me in the hallway. "We need to stop," she said, her voice trembling. "They're going to figure it out." "I know," I replied, though the words felt hollow. She stared at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and something else, something I couldn't name. "Promise me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I promise," I said, though we both knew it was a lie. The breaking point came a few nights later. Our parents had gone to bed early, leaving Emily and me alone in the living room. The tension between us was unbearable, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. She sat on the couch, her knees drawn up to her chest, staring at the flickering light of the TV. I sat across from her, my hands clenched in a fist as I tried to keep my thoughts in check. "I can't do this anymore," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. I looked up, my chest tightening. "Emily." "No," she said, cutting me off. Whatever this is, it's wrong. We both know that." "I know," I said, my voice barely audible. She shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Then why does it feel so impossible to stop?" I didn't have an answer. The next morning, it all came crashing down. I was in the kitchen, pouring myself a cup of coffee, when I heard raised voices coming from the living room. "I know something's going on," Emily's mom said, her tone sharp and accusing. "What are you talking about?" Emily replied, her voice defensive. "Don't play dumb with me," her mom snapped. "I've seen the way you two look at each other." My heart stopped. I set down the coffee mug, my hands trembling as I strained to hear the rest of the conversation. "You're imagining things," Emily said, her voice rising. "Am I?" Her mom shot back. "Because it sure doesn't feel like it." That evening, as we sat around the dinner table, the tension was unbearable. Emily's mom barely touched her food, her eyes darting between Emily and me like she was waiting for one of us to slip. Finally, she set down her fork and looked directly at me. "Ryan," she said, her tone sharp, "is there something you'd like to tell us?" I froze, my mind racing. "What do you mean?" She leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Don't play dumb. I know something's been going on between you and Emily." "Mom, stop," Emily said quickly, her voice trembling. "Emily, don't," her mom snapped, cutting her off. "I want to hear it from him." My dad, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion. Emily's mom turned to him, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "Don't tell me you haven't noticed," she said. "They've been acting strange for weeks." I opened my mouth to deny it, to lie, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of everything we'd done pressed down on me, suffocating. "I'm sorry," I said finally, my voice barely audible. The silence that followed was deafening. My dad stared at me, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. Emily's mom looked like she'd been punched in the gut. Emily burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. "It's my fault," she sobbed. "I started it." "No," I said quickly, my chest tightening. It's not your fault, but the damage was already done. The days that followed were a blur of arguments and accusations. Emily's mom wanted her out of the house immediately, but my dad begged her to reconsider. In the end, they decided it was best for Emily to stay with a relative for a while, giving everyone time to cool off. The morning she left, I stood by the door, watching as she loaded her bags into the car. She didn't look at me, didn't say a word. As the car pulled away, I felt a crushing sense of loss, knowing that whatever we'd had, whatever it was over. In the months that followed, our family struggled to piece itself back together. My dad and Emily's mom worked to rebuild their marriage, while I tried to move on, burying myself in work and avoiding conversations about what had happened. But late at night, when the house was quiet, I couldn't help but think about Emily, about the moments we'd shared and the lines we'd crossed. Some wounds, I realized, never fully heal.